The document on your screen is the course and exam description, including the curriculum framework, and this document is available to the right side of this video in your haiku class. You may want to scroll through and follow along and read in a little bit more detail, as I'm just going to give a brief overview. I'm on page 12 of that document, and on the screen you see 4 skill types that United States history students should be proficient at. The first one is chronological reasoning, then there's comparison and contextualization. Third one is crafting historical arguments from historical evidence, and then finally historical interpretations and synthesis. Each of those 4 skill types have kind of been broken down into different historical thinking skills. We're going to spend a few minutes going over each of those, and I'll explain what they mean to you. So I'm going to scroll through the document here, kind of page by page. So the first skill type, chronological reasoning and historical causation, really says that students who are proficient in AP United States history should be able to compare causes and effects between short and long-term events that happen. You should be able to analyze and evaluate the interaction of multiple causes or effects. So if you have World War I, for example, there may be many, many causes for that, and there are definitely many effects to World War I. You should be able to analyze and explain those different causes and maybe identify the most important one, perhaps. And finally, the third bullet there, you should be able to excuse me, critique existing interpretations of cause and effect. So historians have different explanations for things that happen. You should be able to look at different explanations and kind of determine your own opinion about those and be able to explain and back those up. Skill number 2 is patterns of continuity and change over time. What that means is that students should be able to look at things that happen throughout maybe a long period of time and maybe identify patterns that are happening from maybe in the 1700s things happened for certain reasons, and maybe in the early 1900s similar things happened for either similar reasons or different reasons. You should be able to recognize those and make those connections. You should be able to look at something in one time period and relate it to a different time period, either before or after. Skill 3 is periodization. You ever notice how historians divide history up into chunks of time, you know, from 1492 to 1700, but another historian might divide up that same chunk of time from 1492 to 1720. There's reasons for that. This skill is asking you to be able to look at different periods of history and explain why certain things should fall into a particular period, and then be able to look at 2 historians' views of history and their periodization and explain maybe why one is more valid than another. The next section we'll be talking about is comparison and contextualization, specifically skill 4, comparison. Proficient students should be able to compare related historical developments and processes across place, time, and or different societies or with one society, and explain and evaluate multiple and differing perspectives on a given historical phenomenon. So for example, there have been different waves of immigration throughout United States history. To be proficient in this skill of comparison, you might look at those different waves of immigration and be able to make connections about why people came to the United States, what types of people came, what different problems they encountered. Maybe even look at people who came to the United States and settled on the West Coast versus those who settled on the East Coast. Skill 5, contextualization, is asking students to kind of connect events or processes to broader things occurring at the same time. For example, you could think of it in this way. If you are contextualizing, you might be answering this question: how does the history of a particular group, region, or era fit into the larger story of the development of the United States? So for example, how does the history of a particular group, like immigrants, for example, or women, for example, or minorities, for example, fit into the larger story of the development of the United States? The next skill type, crafting historical arguments from historical evidence, includes skill number 6, historical argumentation. You can read through this section, but basically it's saying, can you use historical evidence to help support your argument? So you may be asked a question and you need to think of evidence throughout the course of history to help explain that. This is where really you'll apply this skill when you're writing your essays or your DBQs. Skill number 7, appropriate use of relevant historical evidence. This skill asks you to be able to choose the best evidence about the past, maybe from a variety of different sources, and to consider content, author, purpose, format, and audience, and then to be able to make some inferences from it, to draw conclusions from this historical evidence. The last skill, skill type 4, includes historical interpretation and synthesis, focuses on skill number 8, interpretation. For this skill, you should be able to analyze diverse historical interpretations and evaluate how historians' perspectives influence their interpretations and how models of historical interpretations change over time. Skill number 8 asks you to be aware of how particular circumstances and contexts, such as perhaps time periods in which individual historians work and write, shape their interpretation of past events. We have a very different interpretation of slavery, for example, now than maybe a historian or someone writing in the mid-1800s had. This skill asks you to be able to be aware of that and maybe to draw some conclusions, or to look at two different interpretations over the course of time and maybe make some comparisons about that as well. Skill 9, synthesis, asks you to put all of those other historical thinking skills together. It asks you to develop meaningful and persuasive new understandings of the past by drawing on different evidence, especially contradictory evidence, and being able to say something intelligent about all of that different evidence, to be able to create a persuasive understanding of the past. You will be practicing these 9 skills throughout the school year. Some of them will be easier and some of them will be more difficult for you, but they are very important skills to practice so that you can think like a historian.